Hello, thank you for joining us. This is a video about neurodiverse learners and social communication. It's designed to help you to think about your language in your teaching and interaction with autistic staff and students. My name is Matthew Harrison. I'm from the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. My role is I coordinate autism intervention. I'm joined by Kylie Tran and Ashley Sutherland from the University of Melbourne Library. And I'm also joined by David Staples, who's part of our autistic community at the University of Melbourne. So David, what is neurodiversity?
Neurodiversity is the idea that there are populations of people who have different ways of thinking than the majority of the population. So that was coined to include autistic people, people on the autism spectrum, but has been expanded to include people with ADHD, with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and other conditions which affect the way their brains process information.
Why is it important to think about how we use language in our teaching?
Because when we're teaching ideas, and we communicate ideas with language. So it's really important to ensure that the way your ideas are being transmitted and received match how you're expecting them to. You want the person to be understanding what you think you're telling them.
What is expressive language?
Expressive language is literally the expression of language. It is turning your thoughts into words and sending them across a line to the other person so that they can hear what you're saying.
What is receptive language?
Receptive language is the other end of that, where you take the noises that some other person has made and turn them into concepts that you can process and understand inside your own head.
Now we're going to talk about some tips for your teaching. The first one is to use language that is clear, precise, and concrete.
If you're using too many metaphors, if your speech is too complicated, if you're using too many subjunctive cases and things like that, too many complicated turns of speech, you might not be understood as well as you think you are. So short, simple statements that are putting forth a simple idea, even if those ideas aren't simple, you can say it almost always in a simple, precise way.
Tip number 2 is to avoid sarcasm, idioms, and hypotheticals because these may be misunderstood.
So most people process things like idioms and hypotheticals without even thinking about it. That's why they're used so much. Someone on the autism spectrum has to process what you've said into what you meant. So if you're talking about it's raining cats and dogs, they might, even just for a moment, think that it's actually got small mammals falling out of the sky. It takes a moment to turn what you said into what you meant. And sometimes that's a bit of extra overhead in cognition that is getting in the way of them understanding the deeper point that you're trying to communicate.
The next tip is to keep interactions focused, make key points explicit and separate from anecdotal illustrations of points.
One of the problems that autists have with cognition is separating the forest from the trees. We can't see the bigger picture because all of the details getting in the way. So if you're making a big point and you're including lots of little anecdotes which explain the point, we can't always tell the difference between what's an illustration and what's the point. We can't tell what's important from what's flavor. Make it clear what the point is, and then make it also clear that this is an illustration of that wider point.
The next tip is to ask closed questions. These are easier to answer than open ones.
This isn't just an autism thing. You'll often find with interviewers, if they want someone to start going on and on, then they'll ask an open question. What do you think of this situation? What that's doing is inviting an extended cogitation on the point, which has got several things going on at once. You're thinking about the question, you're thinking about your attitude to the question, you're thinking about whether you can back it up, you're thinking about how to express it, which is great for an interview on the ABC. But in a class, when you want someone to answer a single point, what you want to do is ask them, can you tell me this fact? You don't want them to start worrying about saying an essay. You don't want them to worry about how they're going to start answering this open question. You just want them to give you this bit of information. Just ask for that bit of information, and then you can continue.
Next tip is to check what has been understood.
Again, this isn't necessarily just an autism thing, but it's more important for autists. What you've said and what has been understood has gone through this filter of the noises that have come through the air. Sometimes they might not have heard you. They might not have understood your metaphor. They might not have understood your very clever reference to the 1980s Battlestar Galactica series. What you think is clear might not have been understood by the person you're talking to. So it's important to check in every so often to make sure that they're still with you and keeping track of where you are and what you're saying.
The next tip is to give time to process information, particularly verbal information. We want to allow students to finish their own sentences.
So when you're speaking to someone, again, there's that filtering and processing step where we turn the sounds that we're hearing into thoughts and information in our heads that we can work on. That takes more time for autists. We tend to have what's called auditory processing disorder, where listening to words isn't easy and takes more cognition to extract meaning from what we hear. On the other end of it, with the expressive language, we're trying to turn our thoughts into sounds to come out of our mouths, and that can be difficult. And if we're interrupted in the process of that, that's like throwing a great big iron bar in front of a train. It derails the whole thing, and first we have to get the train back onto the tracks before we can continue. So trying to preempt what someone's saying, try to finish the sentence, one, you're probably going to get it wrong, and two, you're delaying their ability to get out what they're trying to express and frustrating everyone in the process.
You can use the students' interests to encourage and extend interactions.
Again, not exclusively for autists, but tends to be stronger. Autists have very strong interests. If you can tie in what you're teaching to those interests, you will grab their attention, and they will not only understand what you're saying better because they have a framework around which to put the meaning, but they may be able to extend what you're saying more easily, more quickly in directions you'd never thought of, because they're relaying that information back in terms of a completely different set of metaphors, which they understand deeply.
Another tip is to give frequent and immediate feedback and make rules of behaviour explicit.
Things that seem obvious sometimes aren't. They're learned rules that most people just don't remember having learned. Autists never learned many of these things, or if we did, it was by a conscious process of watching people interact, going back and trying to figure out what the rules are. No one can explain what the rules are. So if an autist does something that is inappropriate or rude or just too outre to be supported, telling them later probably won't help anyone, because they won't remember what the context was, what was going on, what they were thinking, what they thought was going on. Tell them privately, but immediately, as immediately as you can, what they did, why it was wrong, and what was expected in those circumstances. Because if you don't, they're left trying to figure out what's going on by reading shadows on the wall.
The next tip is to clarify to the entire class when questions can be asked. For example, at the end of a lecture, to ensure relevant material is covered.
Because these social rules aren't explicit, because they're not as easily understood as most people think they are. An autist can spend the entire class stressing about whether they should be asking questions now. If you take away the pressure of wondering whether they should be asking questions, you can give them that extra cognitive overhead to actually think about what questions they are going to ask. You're taking away from the stress of whether they should be asking a question and allowing them to think more deeply on what questions to ask.
Tell the student privately if they're asking too many questions, if it is disruptive to the class. But work out with them how their questions can be answered, for example, by private appointment.
If an autist knows about a subject, then they can be, everyone knows that kid, the one who's always got their hand up, the one who's always answering the questions, who may not always have the right answer, but is always stopping everyone else from participating by participating too much. If that's the case, tell them they're doing that. Do it privately, because this is a form of criticism, and you always want to criticize privately, never publicly. If they have too many questions than can be asked in class, and they are legitimate questions that you don't think anyone else is having a problem with, then a private appointment might mean that you answer their questions without disrupting the class and get the best out of both situations.
For more information, have a look at our autism guide, and thanks for watching our video.